It's 9 a.m. and we're going to begin. I want to welcome everyone to this public session of the Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics. I'm Carol Cartwright, co-chair of the Knight Commission, and Arnie Duncan, the other co-chair, and I will be sharing the facilitating duties throughout the morning. Before we introduce the first session, I want to provide a public welcome to our three newest Knight Commission members, Christine Copper, Shantiana Keys, and Peter Roby. Thanks to all of you for being here. I also want to thank Alberto Embargoin, CEO of the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, for the Knight Foundation's support of the meeting and for the Commission's efforts. A few reminders as we begin. This session is being live streamed. Commission members and panelists should use the microphones when speaking, and please draw them close to your mouth. We're pleased to have media and others here to listen to the discussions. Following the conclusion of each session, there will be an opportunity for media to interact with the panelists. And now for our first panelist. Donald Remy is the Executive Vice President of Law, Policy, and Governance and the Chief Legal Officer of the NCAA. His extensive biography is included in the meeting packets that have been provided. As background for this session, on October 11, 2017, the NCAA Board of Governors and the Division I Board of Directors appointed a commission on college basketball chaired by Dr. Condoleezza Rice to examine the following core issues. One, the relationship of the NCAA National Office, member institution, student athletes, and coaches with outside entities, including apparel companies and other commercial entities, non-scholastic basketball, with a focus on the appropriate involvement of college coaches and others, and agents or advisors, with an emphasis on how students and their families can get legitimate advice without being taken advantage of, defrauded, or risking their NCAA eligibility. Two, the NCAA's relationship with the NBA and the challenging effect the NBA's so-called one-and-done rule has had on college basketball. And three, creating the right relationship between the universities and colleges of the NCAA and its national office to promote transparency and accountability. On October 30th of last year, NCAA President Mark Emmert met with our commission and said that the NCAA, and I quote, cannot go into the next basketball season without seeing fundamental change in the way college basketball is operating. After receiving the Commission on College Basketball report on April 25th, 2018, the NCAA boards accepted its recommendations. In this session, we'll provide an overview of the recommendations and proposed next steps. Donald, thank you so much for being here. We look forward to hearing from you.
Well, thank you, Carol, and Arnie, thank you as well. I'd also like to thank Amy and the entire Knight Commission for inviting me to be with you this morning. And thank you all for your continued commitment to integrity, for your continued commitment to the student-athlete experience, to the health and safety of student-athletes, and to ensuring that academic primacy stays in the forefront of all that we do in higher education and college athletics. You know, it's interesting being here in Washington. I haven't been back in a while, and many of you know that I lived here previously, and after having been gone for 7 years, I come back and I walk over to the building today, and there are protests outside, and I thought, man, things haven't changed at all. Wondered whether or not the protests were for me, and was excited that they were for something else. So that's absolutely fabulous. But I got a chance to walk around the city yesterday and see all of the changes in Washington, D.C. and the differences, and I'm really excited about the changes in D.C. and the way things have moved forward. Got a chance to go and watch my Nats play last night and beat the Phillies in a walk-off hit at the end of the 9th inning, and that was an absolutely fabulous game. You know, I'm hopeful that this morning we can have a meaningful and productive and perhaps even in some ways provocative conversation about the things that Carol just described. It is important that we talk about these issues and that we understand the path forward, how the NCAA is going to take the Commission's recommendations and move forward on them, And I know that's something that's of interest of all of you in the Knight Commission and from many around the college athletic environment and in the higher education community. This has been a really interesting academic year. You know, for college sports in particular. Our students, our fans, their families have been able to experience some tremendously exciting events, including championships in cross country and bowling and field hockey and soccer and volleyball and water polo and many, many other championships that we've had in the past and that we'll have to finish out this spring semester. By any measure, when you look at it, and Walt, you know this, the academic success of student athletes has increased year after year after year. Many students in all sports have had opportunities and have seized on those opportunities to continue to be successful in the collegiate environment. Yes, the data on men's basketball players could be better, but we continue to make improvements, and I believe the NCAA, together with all of its members and with the Knight Commission at our side, will continue to assure success and academic progress of all of our student athletes. We've watched the greatest that men's college basketball has to offer. With the little-known academic powerhouse of UMBC turning into the alphabet soup of bracketology during conversations around the water coolers. Peter, I'm guessing you've seen a lot of this over your years on the men's basketball committee, and this was just as exciting as any of the years past, and some would say even more exciting. We've got to witness Loyola Chicago returning to the Final Four. And Chris, I know you and I talked about this at the Final Four at just the right time for college basketball, with just the right approach to it, and with Sister Jean leading the way. You couldn't have asked for a more perfect scenario in the Final Four given all that's going on. But yet, as Carol talked about, we've also witnessed the worst that men's college basketball has to offer. FBI, DOJ, sting operations, arrests, wire and mail fraud, bribery, and other federal crimes, all at the hands of all kinds of individuals, a cast of financial planners and agents and clothiers. I was surprised at the clothiers and apparel company executives and grassroots and even NCAA coaches. You look at this and you think it's a made-for-the-big screen John Grisham novel, if it weren't the reality that we're all living in. And recognizing that reality, and as Carol mentioned, quickly responding to it, you saw the NCAA in its leadership jump into action. Bud, with the Board of Governors and with the Board of Directors of Division I and President Emmerich creating the Independent Commission on College Basketball to focus on some of these issues and try to find solutions. Carol walked through the charge of the commission, and so I won't go through that again, but when you think about it, it was focused on trying to deal with some of the root causes of corruption in men's college basketball. Doesn't mean it was focused on solving every single problem. There are a lot of problems that exist out there in the world of college sports. But it was focused on some of those core problems: access to the NBA, the use of agents and advisors, the apparel company influence, and the integrity of the grassroots basketball community and events, and indeed the enforcement and infractions process that many of us and you and the Knight Commission have talked about year after year after year. But further, there was a considerable amount of attention paid to the commission's work that focused on things that weren't necessarily in the core charge of the Independent Commission on College Basketball, but folks in the sports and the political and the mainstream media oftentimes looked at the circumstances and suggested that the only solution was to develop a different system of college athletics in the basketball arena, a system where the athletes who participate in the sports are paid professionals, that they go to work every day and receive a salary for their compensation, a compensation for their work. essentially suggesting that we jettison the college basketball model as we know it and focus on creating something different altogether. The Commission's report suggested and indicated that they reflected on this very option, but instead decided to double down, some would even say triple down, on the integration of sports in the higher education community. Dr. Rice and commission members were clear that the participants of college sports must be students, and they must be students first and foremost. Indeed, as pointed out in the commission report, student athletes and their families, they benefit tremendously from the student athletes' experience, from the college sports program, from academic support, to meals, to travel, to coaching, to career advice, and indeed to lifetime earning potential. All of that comes along with the participation in college sport. Access to higher education through college sports provides a pathway to success for the rest of their lives. In basketball, NCAA data show that this is not just the case for the 60 or so, fewer than 60 in fact, student athletes that might end up being drafted into the NBA, but also for the 5,400 men's basketball student athletes that don't go into the league. So to continue to achieve the success and the known wrongs that we have seen, we, the NCAA family, must recommit to our core purpose as a higher education association and renew our commitment to providing a meaningful education with a college degree as the centerpiece of all we do. Failure to do so, that's just not an option. I've heard it over and over and over again within the membership, within the halls of the national office. We must get at this, and we must be successful. The distinctions between the professional basketball experience and the NCAA basketball experience, well, they're important, and I think in many ways they must remain separate. However, the commission recommended, and we support, that some need a path, a clearer path to become a professional. Whether they want to go pro after college or they want to have no college at all, they should have those options. And those options are incredibly important. I, for one, I believe that there's a college experience for everyone, should they so choose that college experience. And if young men want to go to college and they want to spend 4 years there and they want to complete their programming and get a degree before going pro, like commission members David Robinson or Grant Hill, they should have that choice. More students like Darius Baisley should also have a clear path to the developmental league if that is their choice. And it's good to see that the NBA has made that a more viable option for some. Or if instead of college, students want to go to Europe or outside the United States, like Brandon Jennings, they should have that choice too. Options should be available to the student athletes. If they want to attend college for 3 years, and after a tremendous NCAA tournament like Dante DiVincenzo, they want to declare for the draft and see whether or not they have professional prospects, yeah, that's an option too. They should have all of those options. And if they want to go straight to the NBA, like a Dwight Howard or a LeBron James or a Kobe Bryant, that too should be an option. They should have those choices, and the NCAA is committed to rapid and meaningful change to make sure that those options are available, and also to improve the path for college matriculation. You've heard us say this before. It's been in our public statements. You've heard Dr. Emmert say it, and Carol just mentioned it as part of what Dr. Emmert said when he came and talked to you before. By the 2018-2019 season tip-off, consistent with the Commission's recommendations, the NCAA will adopt a series of bold legislative policy and structural changes that we hope will profoundly alter the college basketball landscape. That will be the beginning of this process. But it won't be the end. There's a lot of work to be done, and the NCAA is fully committed to restoring the trust and confidence in basketball and college sports more generally that existed before and that will exist again. The NCAA membership understands the challenges. It understands its role in creating those challenges and has taken ownership of the issues surrounding college basketball. The various stakeholders who regularly have a difference of perspective about all kinds of solutions have come together. They really have, at the fundamental level. The head coaches, the ADs, the faculty athletics representatives, and others, we all must engage in a problem-solving exercise together to implement the Commission's recommendations. And that's exactly what we're doing. Others outside the NCAA also must be committed to this change. Change will not end with just NCAA actions. You've seen the recommendations, and some of them go far beyond the walls of Indianapolis. The NCAA will work with these other organizations like USA Basketball, like the apparel companies, the NBA Players Association to make meaningful and lasting changes. Those changes will support the Commission's recommendations around transparency and summer basketball. We hope that other groups of people also engage, important people, to this dialogue and to these changes in the youth community, in the high school community, in the college and professional basketball, all alike will recognize the importance of transparency and the importance of cooperation to fix the challenges that exist in the basketball landscape. We need them all to be as fully engaged as the NCAA is committed to being. As Bud Peterson can tell you, the Board of Governors is already on it. They've begun to develop solutions for association-wide recommendations, like the Independent Board of Governors members that the Commission recommended and the Knight Commission has talked about in the past, and presidential certification for athletics compliance. Christine can tell you that the Division I members on the board and the council have already started to assemble to deal with some of the challenges that will require changes to the Division I rules, to policy, to legislation. Members have organized themselves into several committees, and I know that we'll get to talk about this in a little bit. But committees designed to focus on some of the recommendations that the Rice Commission has put forward. And we look to have those recommendations put forward to the board in August for approval. Those committees of the Division I Council, they include a diverse set of people from all across the membership. Groups on the Men's Basketball Oversight Committee, groups like the Division I Committee on Infractions, they're all involved in focusing on the changes that need to be made. Experts within the membership reaching outside the membership to help build solutions for the future. Guys, we're only 14 weeks away between now and the board meeting. A lot of work has to be done in that time frame. This is not NCAA as usual. Work's already begun. Recognition of the tight time frame is apparent to everyone, and these groups will meet regularly and have target dates for development of solutions and presentation of those solutions in August to our board to find the pathways for student-athlete success, looking at agent certification and degree completion, independent, neutral investigation, stiffer penalties, along the way, greater accountability. People are really focused and appreciative of greater accountability, whether that's contractual obligations or, as I mentioned, stiffer penalties. Accountability will be increased. Financial transparency, collaboration with others, as I mentioned. We have working groups focused on all of these issues so that we can develop these solutions as the Commission has laid out for the future. I'll end with this. College sports itself is a uniquely American and beloved, a uniquely American phenomenon, beloved across the United States as a whole. You heard the Commission talk about the public trust and the NCAA being a public trust. Because of that public trust, this is a core responsibility of the NCAA. Includes university presidents and athletics administrators and the national office alike, to restore that public's trust. Given some of the past actions and the experience with the slowness of our process, it's understandable that some, and even you, Mr. Secretary, express skepticism that the NCAA is capable of getting this done. But I can assure you that we're going to work long, hard hours on a rapid timeline to achieve success. We ask, though, that there also be some patience, realistic patience to let some of the changes take hold. You can't change culture overnight. And these cultural changes we need to be vigilant about every single day. We need to focus on them and assure that whatever rules changes, whatever legislative changes, whatever policy changes are made, they stick. And they stick in a way that is effective to change the culture that has led to some of the challenges that we see in college men's basketball. We are committed to doing this. We won't stop until we get it right. We have a short timeline to get it done, and we welcome all participants in helping develop the solutions that will stay forever. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Donald. We've, of course, studied the report very carefully and have some, I think, very pointed follow-up questions that commissioners are interested in posing to you.
Thank you, Carol.
Don, I'll start off. Thank you for coming back to DC and willing to sit in front of the commission and take some questions. You use the term rapid and meaningful change. I think the most important change probably starts at the top in terms of governance. We at the Knight Commission are very pleased with the recommendation about independent board governance, like you'd see in corporations and large nonprofits. I thought that Secretary Rice did a fine job pointing out that independent directors are very good for well-run organizations. I'd like to know specifically about the timetable for this change, for these new independent members of the Board of Governors to be able to take a seat in this important directional change that's happening at the NCAA.
Thank you for your question, Dr. Howard. It is indeed an important recommendation and an important change that the NCAA is committed to. We're focused on trying to make sure that we can find the path to provide for independent directors as quickly as possible. Our structure is such that the composition of the Board of Governors is in the Constitution of the association. And so we will work quickly to make sure that we have membership buy-in along the way so that we can put forward the recommendations for how we will do that in the August timeframe. It may take a little longer for the membership to actually vote to include those members on the Board of Governors and for us to actually nominate and appoint those members on the Board of Governors. But the solutions for how to get there will be developed and will be presented to the board by August.
One final follow-up on any possibility of getting those directors in the August board meeting itself, even if they're not formal voting members, but some capacity, maybe advisory or something. So it's almost like a half step and then a full step. Any possibility of getting there even sooner?
Well, as they say, anything is possible. Although I believe that we need to develop the structure and the system for actually adding to the Board of Governors before the Board of Governors members, whomever they might be, are appointed to the board. And so our commitment is to, by August, to have the pathway for additional board members to be added to the Board of Governors.
Thank you.
Donald, it might be helpful if you went through kind of the process that the NCAA is going to use to implement the changes, all of the changes with the exception of the governance, and why those two processes may be a little different.
Well, thank you, Dr. Peterson. And I'll start with the change to the Board of Governors, since that was the question that was just presented. That process is a process that's governed by our NCAA Board of Governors and not by the Division I Board or the Division I Council. And so that process itself will start and evolve and develop and ultimately be put forward by the board that will then require a membership vote to bring those new members onto the Board of Governors. That's already underway. The structure for doing that is already underway. And as I mentioned, by August, we'll have a pathway to achieve that through whatever membership processes are appropriate to achieve it. The balance of the recommendations have been directed by the Division I Board to the Division I Council. And the Division I Council has structured itself so that it can take each of the recommendations in categories and examine solutions to those recommendations, whether those solutions would require legislation, would require policy, or would require simple procedural changes. Those groups out of the Division I Council will develop that process, and they'll bring them forward to the Division I Board for a vote in August. Legislation is the most difficult. However, the Division I Board has committed to enacting appropriate legislation at the August meeting as the council brings that information to them for a vote. As I mentioned in my initial remarks, that's quite different than what you usually would have through the NCAA's legislative process. It doesn't ordinarily happen in a 14, 15, 16-week cycle. But that's what's going to happen in this instance. If there are policy recommendations that are association-wide, those policy recommendations will go to the Board of Governors, and the Board of Governors will be able to act upon those in August. The goal here is to have the recommendations of the commission to be structured in a way that can be implemented before the next basketball season, before the 2018-2019 season starts. And so the work has already begun, the structure is already laid out, the pathway to engaging with those outside of the NCAA is already laid, and we're looking forward to being able to bring things to the board in August and to have things operationalized and executed by the basketball season.
So before, hi Don, I'm Nancy
Hey.
Zimfer.
Hey,
Thank you for
Nancy.
coming.
Good to see you.
Before we leave this issue for the moment, the idea, what's in a number might be based on a principle that a majority of the board and the D1 council be independent members. So we're suggesting a principle that far extends the representation that we might be able to execute by or around August. So has there been a conversation about the number and the principle of independent directors?
Hey, good morning, Nancy. With respect to the number, the commission laid out the addition of 5 independent members for the Board of Governors. We are in the process of trying to determine how to achieve that. There hasn't yet been a conversation around additional members more than the 5 that have been recommended to be included on the Board of Governors. But as the path is laid out for independent members of the board, the process will examine how that should be structured, where those individuals should come from, how they should be nominated and appointed to the Board of Governors, and when that will occur. With respect to the Division I board or the council, there have been conversations in the past, and you all probably know that, around changing in composition of the Division I board. And I suspect as we continue to examine how to restore the public trust in college athletics as a whole, the conversations that have occurred in the past likely will reemerge around whether or not and how to achieve a greater level of integrity in the decision making, and whether that would include changes to the composition of the Division I board or the council remains to be seen. But those conversations certainly are conversations that can be had.
Donald, I think you know that the Knight Commission has long been interested in transparency, particularly on the financials. We were a proponent of the 1992 rule that required approval by university presidents for any coaches' athletically related outside income. And we think that the NCAA's elimination of that rule in 2016 created a pretty large loophole, since many schools don't require such approval on their own, and the NCAA reporting forms no longer collect data from schools on outside income. We also think that the newly proposed rules for operators of recruiting showcases set much higher standards for them for reporting shoe and apparel income than the NCAA expects of its own schools and their coaches. So we plan to offer a recommendation to close this gap by reinstating and strengthening the financial reporting requirements for NCAA school and coaches for money received from shoe, equipment, and apparel companies. Could this proposal be included as a part of the package of reforms that you've already started proceeding with, and could it be added and approved at the August meeting? And could the NCAA set up a code or standards for apparel companies that the NCAA then would audit in order for schools or conferences to sign these multi-million-dollar contracts?
Well, there's a lot in that question there, Dr.
Absolutely.
Cartwright. You know, the work of the association is not exclusively focused on the recommendations of the Rice Commission. There are many other issues that continue to work their way through the system and that will eventually make their way into policy or procedures or legislation. And so no one should think that the only thing that the association is focused on is the set of recommendations that the Commission on College Basketball has put forward. There are other things that continue to be evaluated and that necessarily need to be evaluated. Some of them may be evaluated on that same time frame that we've discussed in terms of trying to get them done by the August meeting, or at least get legislation proposed by that point in time. Some of them will continue to go through the process of the normal legislative cycle, but with hopes that they can be achieved early on and perhaps even before the next year when legislation is passed in January. With respect to the specific items that you've referenced regarding transparency, one thing is clear. The Commission on College Basketball focused on transparency as a necessary component of all of its recommendations to assure that there's accountability along the way. And that will be clear in the way that the membership develops solutions to implement those recommendations. The issue around the transparency of coaches' compensation is one that has left a lot of people perplexed, you know. But I will say this is one of those instances where you shouldn't confuse conspiracy with the unintended consequences of action. I think that change, which was made a couple of years ago, was done to deal with duplication and reporting that was being done through other processes. It's time to reevaluate that change and to look in the context of all of transparency to determine how we can make sure that people will be held accountable through a variety of different means, one of them being that information be available so that we can understand, we, the entire athletics community, can understand how the finances are flowing.
You know, we've been pretty persistent, so we're likely to keep coming back to you with some of these suggestions. Scott, I think you had a question. Do you want to take the next turn?
Sure. Donald, two questions, one very specific and one more general, really dealing with the NCAA and the college football playoff. The specific question is this. What is the NCAA's position, if they have any, or your thoughts on the fact that the college football playoff is not contributing any net revenue to the NCAA, when in fact the NCAA is incurring costs that benefit members of the CFP?
Yeah, I know this has been an issue, yet again, one of those issues that's been raised by the Knight Commission perennially, if you will. And it's one that has been examined and thought about over time. The reality is that the association looks at its members as a whole and looks at the contributions that they provide to all of our athletics programming. And the college football playoff system makes its own determinations for how it's going to allocate its funds. And so I suppose the question is better put to the CFP membership and executives than it is to the NCAA. But I will say that the member institutions who make up the teams that compete in the college football playoffs all contribute equally to the goals of the NCAA.
That leads me to my more general question. The general question is this. You articulated, and I believe strongly, that you have a laudable goal to restore the public trust in the NCAA to oversee athletics. How is that possible with the existence of the CFP outside of the NCAA and the fact that the autonomous conferences have a unique position both in the NCAA and also really in the CFP? So how is it that you can claim that you can have a goal for all intercollegiate athletics, given these two organizations out there, in many ways, with the autonomous conference or the power conferences having unique power structure for both?
You remember that that unique power structure, the autonomous power structure, is still within the NCAA. And those universities, those 65 universities that make up the autonomy conferences, participate in the NCAA governance process more broadly. They participate at every level in that process, whether it's by student athlete participation or by chancellor or president participation. And so I believe that we all are working toward the same goal, that even though they have the CFP event that's hosted and put on outside of the NCAA, the schools, the conferences that put on that event, that participate in the CFP, also participate in the NCAA governance process and are equal contributors to try to find the solutions for tomorrow.
So are you comfortable then that the structure of the CFP and the NCAA as right now is in the best interest overall of intercollegiate athletics?
I think that the Autonomous 5 component of the governance structure works very well. Those schools who have a greater amount of financial capability have the ability to put forward proposals and programs in the best interest of the student athlete. And they do, and they have. They've shown over time that they have. I think that that component of the governance structure is a valuable component and can allow those schools to be leaders within the association to assure that we all achieve the same goal.
Yeah, thanks.
Donald, I'd like to follow up on that a little bit with a different type of question. With respect to the comments that President Emmert has made about bold reform before the 2018-19 season, and then your own comments with respect to restoring the public trust in the NCAA, one of the recommendations that's come out of the commission is a independent enforcement and investigation function going forward. And so I'm curious as to how likely you feel like that will get implemented in the short term, how important do you view that? And given Scott's question with respect to CFP revenues, based on what I think we've all seen in terms of research about the number of major violations that are committed by folks in the Autonomous 5 conferences and likely participants in the CFP, how appropriate it would be for funding for that independent investigation and enforcement to come from those revenues.
So to the beginning of your question, Peter, the independent enforcement and infractions process is on the same timeline with a goal toward having solutions available for the board to examine in August. This too is something that's incredibly important and that we're all focused on trying to achieve. Many of you know this has been a recommendation that's been out in the public stream, something that the Knight Commission has talked about previously, and something that we'll work really hard to try to deliver. It's complicated though. Those who have participated in arbitration before understand how the arbitration process works, and that is one of the Commission's recommendations for this path, to examine how arbitration works and perhaps to create this system for the complex cases that will include an arbitration component. It also suggests that we have an independent investigatory body to deal with that. I think that if you have that system, if you have that structure as the Commission has laid it out, you have the pathway to deal with these more complex and serious violations. It will change behavior. Remember, added to the new system are also additional penalties, stiffer penalties, penalties that many of us would be challenged if they were placed upon our institutions to try to continue our athletics programs. And so it's hopeful that the new system with the new penalty structure will actually deter the bad behavior, whether it occurs within schools in the Autonomy 5 conferences or it occurs within schools in other conferences. All behavior will change as a result of the possibilities and prospects and promise of this new system and the penalties that come along with it. As it relates to the funding of how this new system will be structured, that's yet to be determined. Indeed, there will be a cost associated with creating a system to deal with complex cases that doesn't involve the volunteers that presently handle those infraction cases within the NCAA. And we have to examine how we're going to pay for that new structure and that new system and make it effective.
I know that there are at least two people who want to get in here before we end, and we're going straight from this panel into the second one. So, Walt, I'll go to you next.
I wanted to ask you about one of the issues which received a lot of public criticism, including from one of our next panelists, because they didn't take a particular attitude toward it, and that's the name, image, likeness question. I also know that matters under litigation, and that you're probably going to be limited about all you can say. But I also know that the NCAA has had a lot of discussion about this over a period of time. So given that there is litigation going on now about this, I wonder if you could give us a little update about how the NCAA is looking at this issue.
So this is the challenge of being the chief legal officer and answering a question like that. But I appreciate your question, Walt. There has been a lot of conversation about this issue, both before the commission issued its report and subsequent to the issuance of the report. I've heard some suggestions from the plaintiffs' bar that the commission's response to the issue was cowardly. I'll tell you, anybody who spent any time with David Robinson or Condi Rice would not use a coward as a word to describe either of those people. I think that the commission understood the complexities of the name, image, and likeness challenges and recognized those, but at the same time reflected an appreciation for the changing times that we're in. And if you look at the NCAA's decision making over time, you'll see that there is a common sense application to the rules underway, a recognition of the changing in the times, of the activities and actions of the millennial. When the rules were originally written, you didn't have individuals creating their own channels on the internet and the like, and now you do. And so we've attempted through our processes to find a way to allow student athletes to engage in the behavior that all other students engage in nowadays on our campuses, and at the same time to stay true to the structure that we have, the structure that's part and parcel of what we do. There's confusion, Walt, between name, image, and likeness and pay for play. I think it's out there. Some people look at it and they put it together, and there's even confusion that has existed in the courts over time. But the truth is, pay for play is one thing, and that's seeking compensation for athletic services. And name, image, and likeness is something totally different, and we've dealt with it differently. But we also understand the challenges that we have in the courts, and the rules that have been laid out, and the parameters that have been laid out by the court that most recently dealt with this, and the NCAA, indicating, much like the commission did, that education is paramount, and recognizing that benefits that are tethered to education are entirely appropriate, but also recognizing that those that go beyond the educational commitment that our universities provide to our student athletes are not necessarily anything that the NCAA should be forced to do. So as the Secretary laid out in the Rice Commission report, it's something that will continue to be talked about, but at this point in time, it's not something that there's a recommendation from the commission that we deal with immediately.
We're going to take one last question, and then we'll bring up our next panel. So, Nancy, I'll go to you.
Yeah, thank you. Just quickly, we're going to make a very supportive statement of the Commission's recommendation on some kind of credential standards for NCAA coaches, and basketball is probably one of a broad-based commitment to the standards of leadership and professional development that our coaches should exhibit. We understand that the NCAA is an investor in the National Association of Basketball Coaches. The question is really, what are you investing in, and how do you know you're getting a return on your investment?
Well, indeed, Nancy, the NCAA does provide several $1 million to the National Association of Basketball Coaches, and we partner with the NABC on a lot of activities, including some training activities that are available for our coaching community. We try to find ways through our national office staff to provide training to athletics administrators, assistant coaches, and head coaches alike. Peter, you can talk about some of your participation in those training activities that the NCAA has engaged in over the years to assure that coaches have the right tools to continue to advance in their profession. That's not funding per se, but those are resources of the association that are dedicated toward coaching professional development. With respect to certification, the certification that USA Basketball does is done in coordination with the NCAA and the NABC, and something that we'll continue to look at to figure out how and whether it can be made better and more available and more accessible to all. But at the end of the day, we are committed to trying to make sure that coaches have the tools necessary to continue to be successful in a world where integrity is paramount.
I think we would all agree to that. I want to underscore that metrics and measuring the outcomes or value of coaching education and standards is really what we're driving at, and that would be our expectation, that we know more about the effects of professional development for our coaches. So thank you.
Fair enough and understood.
Unfortunately, we've come to the end of the time available for this session, so with great thanks to you, Donald, for a productive and informative session. We say thank you, and we'll call up our next panel. We'll begin again in 5 minutes, and then after the second panel, we'll take a break.
Thank you all for your time and attention.